And that will lead into our discussion of replications, where we take a look at the different types of replications. And then we'll use that to illustrate one of the biggest things you can do with replications, which is discover boundary conditions. So we're mentioning this work because what we did today is basically a replication of Janet Metcalfe's work. So a replication is basically what it sounds like. Is when you do something again, you replicate a particular experiment. It's what your method section is meant for, so that people can read your method section and replicate your experiment. So replications, there are different types of replications. There's your exact replication, and then there is a conceptual replication. Those are the two types from your textbook. Some people consider a third one, but we'll go with what your text has. Two types, exact replications and conceptual replications. Exact replications are pretty easy to understand. These are literally just redos of the experiment. You repeat the experiment as closely as practical, and you change as little as possible. So you are going to have to change some things, right? You can't use the same subjects that were around in 1986, right? Janet Metcalfe will not come out of retirement to run this experiment for you, right? So there are some things that we need to change, but you change as little as possible. Basically, you go to that publication and you go to the method section and you say, all right, experiment number 1, procedure. Subjects were given a sheet of paper. I'll give subjects a sheet of paper on which was written the BC problem. I'll give them the BC problem. They were told that they would be asked to write down a number between 0 and 10. I'll tell them to write down a number between 0 and 10, right? So you do it as closely as possible to the original experiment, and that is your replication. And then, incidentally, that's literally where I got the BC problem from. All right, so that's an exact replication. Not too difficult to understand. You just redo what you've done before. More interesting, though, and more, I would argue, valuable, is the conceptual replication. So the conceptual replication is where you repeat the experiment, but you change some aspects of the variables. You change some way of doing the experiment. So in an independent variable, you might change the operational definitions, right? So you might change how it is that you measure feelings of knowing, for example, right? How it is that they're using a scale of 0 to 10. You might use a scale of 0 to 7, right? You might change it by saying, instead of having them self-report, I'm going to hook them up to a galvanic skin response machine. I'm going to basically hook them up to a lie detector test. And I'm going to see if they have physiological responses that they're getting close to the answer. So you can change your independent variable, for example, their operational definitions. You can change the operational definitions of your dependent variable. So what is it that you're measuring? You're measuring feeling of knowing. Are there other things that go along with feeling of knowing? You can change how you measure those. So the galvanic skin response would actually be the independent variables changing their operational definitions. And then also, very importantly, you can change the control variables. So control variables are, in any experiment, there are some aspects of the experiment that could change, that could be different, but you keep them the same for every single subject, right? So in this experiment, Janet Metcalfe's experiment, the time between when subjects had to indicate their feeling of knowing, that could have been 10 seconds. She used 10 seconds. It's quite possible to do that every 30 seconds. We just did it every 30 seconds. It's quite possible to do it every 10 seconds, 20 seconds. It's quite possible to just do it every single minute. So there's a bunch of variable values that it could take, but what you do in an experiment is you just make a decision and you say, I want the same level for every single subject, so I'm going to do it 10. So Janet Metcalfe said, one of my control variables is going to be the time between responses. I'm going to choose 10 seconds. And when I did this replication, I said one of my control variables is going to be the time between responses. but I'm going to choose 30 seconds. All right, so there's a number of different control variables that go into any experiment. Which riddle do you choose? She could have chosen the BC problem. She could have chosen the sage's hat. She could have chose the 2-monk problem. She could have chose, Achilles versus the turtle. She could have chosen a number of different riddles. Those are all that's a variable. Which riddle are you going to choose? But she said, I want one riddle for all my subjects. I'm going to choose the BC problem. I chose a different level. I said, I want one riddle for all my subjects. I chose the sage's hat. So in these conceptual replications, you can change those control variables, the levels that they have. You can change the dependent and independent variables, the operational definitions that you use. So far, so good? All right. So why would you ever do this? Why would you ever do a conceptual replication? What are one of the benefits of doing a conceptual replication? Well, one of the benefits is that it's a great way of discovering boundary conditions, what's known as boundary conditions. And what a boundary condition is, these are the specific conditions or criteria outside of which the phenomenon you just found in your experiment will not operate. So they are literally the boundaries at which the phenomenon that you found will fail to occur. And those boundary conditions are very important in psychology because you want to know, will this psychological effect work in general? Will it have no boundary conditions? It just works for everybody all the time? Or does it have certain boundary conditions? Is there a boundary condition in terms of how you phrase it? Who it applies to? What time of the day? What are these possible characteristics where the phenomenon that you found, outside of those characteristics, it would not occur? So let's take a look at some boundary conditions, and let's see if we can identify any boundary conditions for our results. So if you take a look at our results for people that achieved the correct solution, all right, so these are our results over here. These are Janet Metcalf's results. So what Janet Metcalf found was that if you solve the problem correctly, you would have no feeling of warmth, no feeling of warmth, no feeling of warmth, no feeling of warmth, and then boom, you would have that feeling of warmth. On the other hand, what we found in previous classes, and what we'll probably find with this class as well, so this is previous data, what we found is that for subjects, when they were 120 seconds out from the correct solution, when they were 120 seconds out from saying, oh my gosh, it's a blue hat, because if it was a white hat, that other sage would be able to solve it immediately, so it's got to be a blue hat. For subjects who said blue hat, 120 seconds out, they thought they were getting close, right? So about 2 minutes out, they were like, I'm about a third of the way, right? 3 was the highest rating. And then when it got to about 90 seconds out, it was in around this area. It was in around the 5 to 6 area. And then when it got to 60 seconds out, 60 seconds out is here. When it got to 30 seconds out, they felt even closer. Most of them said, I'm at about a 7 out of 10. And then when they solved it, they were like, yep, 10 out of 10, blue hat, there it is. So unlike Janet Metcalf's results, where there was no increase in feeling of knowing before the solution, in our study, for the sage's hat, there was this increase in feeling of knowing before people got to the solution. So we did not replicate her findings. We did not replicate or get the same results. So what that means is that we have crossed a boundary condition. So this happened in her experiment. This phenomenon occurred in her experiment. That phenomenon did not occur in our experiment. We have gradual increases in feelings of knowing. So there's a condition that we crossed outside of which this phenomenon does not hold. So the question is, if that's the original phenomenon, these feelings of warmth follow an insight pattern, and we found that the feelings of warmth do not follow an insight pattern, we must have crossed a boundary condition. So what are the possible boundary conditions that we actually found? Other way to answer this, what was the difference between our study and the one that Janet Metcalf did? So there are three major ones. Yep.
Did she have groups or?
So she did not have groups. So difference number one, possible boundary condition number one, she ran subjects individually, we ran subjects in groups. So clearly we've crossed a boundary condition. Maybe this pattern works with individuals, but this phenomenon does not hold when you're doing group cognition. So that was difference number one, groups versus individuals. There's two more. Yep.
The riddle that we use.
The riddle. So this was for anagrams and the BC riddle. We used the Sage's hat. Maybe the Sage's hat riddle is a different type of problem. Maybe it's a different type of riddle, and that's the difference that that's the boundary that we crossed that caused this phenomenon to no longer occur. So that's two. There's one more. Yep.
The timing intervals.
The timing intervals. So she used 10-second intervals. We used 30-second intervals. So that could make a big difference. So imagine you have to check in with your group every 10 seconds. It's going to be, you'll basically have no time to dedicate to actually trying to solve the problem. So that could have been the boundary. Maybe this only works in a 10-second interval, but as soon as you get to longer intervals where you actually have time to kind of check in with yourself and say, how do I feel about this? You know, how am I before the clock strikes 10 again? And you're like, oh my gosh, I got to write down something. Maybe with this 30-second time interval, you actually have more time to access your inner feelings of knowing. So those are the possible boundary conditions we found. So the original phenomenon, it works for individuals, maybe doesn't work for groups. It works for 10-second intervals, maybe not for 30-second. And it works for BC problem and anagrams, maybe not for the Sage's hat. So I keep saying maybe for each of these. So what can we do? What next experiments would we want to do to test which of these boundary conditions caused this failure of the phenomenon? Because it could be any one of them, it could be all of them. What would we do next? Yep.
Only change one of like the group's intervals or riddle-based.
Exactly. So this conceptual replication has identified these three as potential boundary conditions. And we know that it's at least one of them, right? We have to have crossed some boundary to get to this. But which one of them is it? Is it more than one of them? We would want to do exactly what you suggested. We would want to test, we would want to replicate this experiment, but only change one thing. So we would want to use groups, but in a 10-second interval with the BC problem. Or we would want to use individuals, but with a 30-second interval and the BC problem. Or we would want to run three experiments. We'd want to use individuals and the 10-second intervals, but then do the Sage's hat. So if we ran individuals and the 10-second conditions, and we used the Sage's hat, and we replicated her findings, then we know that this boundary is not because of the Sage's hat, right? It had to have been because of one of the other two. So what you would want to do is you would want to only change one of these three, keep the other two the same. We would run three more experiments, and then that would identify which of these is actually a boundary condition, which one of these did we cross. All right, that was our look at replications and boundary conditions. Any questions on that? Make sense? All right.